pajamas, of course. Thanks for the invitation, Todd. My name is James Priest. As you know, I'm a co-developer of something called Sociocracy 3.0. And when Todd asked me if I would come and speak for this meetup, I agreed, and I think the best way we could go forward with this would be with a kind of fireside chat type conversation. I'd love to have this a little bit interactive, give you a chance to engage as well. So what I was planning was to start by understanding a little bit about what motivated some of you to join this call today. And I'll use that as a springboard to talk for a few minutes, after which I will hit pause. And I'd like to invite your questions and reflections, and we'll use that as a way to navigate from there. So I've invited Todd to jump in at any point he would like to kind of direct things in some way. He and you, probably many of you have a much better idea about the purpose of this group. Hey, Patrick, than me. So my main intention is to just deliver as much value as I can to you as possible. And a good starting point for that is to know what you would expect or wish for today. So with that said, if any of you would be willing, I'm not sure how this works generally, but I prefer you just jump in. And if you jump in on top of someone else, we'll figure that out. But could a few of you just share very briefly why you joined the call today and or what you would enjoy to get from this call today?
And happy to put that, if you put that in chat or raise your hand, all good too, or jump out. Yeah. Sorry,
yeah, or just tell me. Also good.
I didn't know of it, so that's why I joined. I wanted to learn more of it. Sociocracy, my God, I can't even say it. Yeah, so looking forward to getting all of it. I unfortunately have to leave at around 12:30, so that is the best I can do today. Quite sorry, but I'm really happy to soak all of this in.
Great, thank you, Patrick. Anyone else? So from David, always interested in methods. I didn't have the chat open here. Here we go. Always interested in methods for scaling and maximizing impact and engagement for Agile projects. Great, okay. And Erin here, curious about sociocracy in general and its implications for Agile. Okay, great. So because Todd is here, somebody said, there you go, Todd, you got a fan base. Anyone else?
Mary, you had your hand up.
Mary, yeah.
Yeah, I'm so small on the screen right now. I can't really see myself very well. My picture's small, but I've kind of heard of Agile before. I was going to go to a writers group who she said that she was going to incorporate, that she had been trained, I guess maybe with this very program. I didn't end up going, but I'm interested in how people can collaborate more effectively, say with innovative ideas. I personally am working to start a writers group, and I'm kind of interested in paradigm shifts of society. So that's where I'm at. Okay, thank you, Mary. And we have a couple more things in the chat here. So curious about the term and like the previous events from the group. This is from Kiran. Like previous events because I got a new perspective and new insights. So Amanda, also working in change management and interested in seeing what I can learn today to apply to our teams and projects, especially given the complexities of some of the files we support and the need for collaboration and engagement for such projects to be successfully implemented and changes to be adapted. Okay, wonderful. That's definitely helping me to get an idea of what some of you are hoping for from the call today. Would anyone else like to jump in with anything?
I'm going to leave the room. Oh, go ahead.
Hi.
Hey.
I'm an organizational development practitioner and I pay attention to structure. So how structures affect human relationships, productivity, mental health. And I'm playing in that space with my clients right now where they're starting to see how organizing ourselves in ladders and silos is actually running counter to what they say they want in terms of collaboration and working horizontal, even with equality and diversity and inclusion. So I'm really curious about how sociocracy talks about structure, and kind of plays with two different design principles. We have to stay in top-down bureaucracy to a certain extent, but we also have to invite different ways of collaborating that Agile does really well.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful, Tracy. Anyone else? I'm taking a few notes here as I go, so I'm not the best at multitasking. So if you see me looking away, I've got a second screen here. Cesare, apologies if I destroyed your name there, Cesare or Kesari. Developing better ways to leverage human intelligence in complex systems. Okay, great. Okay.
I feel that we talk a lot about Agile. We have Agile coaches in place, like change management, whatever, but progress is really slow. I've always said if Agile was so wonderful, we'd all be doing it, it'd be easy. So how do we see progress? How do we make things happen and move quicker?
Okay. How do we see progress and how to make things happen quicker? And I think what might be useful, because I could, but I'm sure there's some of you even more qualified for this than I am. If someone would be willing just to jump in for a couple of minutes, give us a quick 101. What is Agile and why is that relevant in the workplace today? So I'm looking to any of you with some experience around that. It would be great. And then I'll use that as a starting point to talk about S3.
All right, I'll bite.
Thank you, Todd.
Agile, at least for me, is discovering new ways of working based on a certain set of values and principles. As we know, is the Agile Manifesto. But a lot of these things come before then. Different ways of working and doing things. I'd say that's the alternative or punk rock movement of work, doing things differently and differently.
Thank you, Todd. And Patrick also kindly posted something into the chat there. For those of you who can't see that or you're listening after the call today, Agile methodology, meaning a practice that promotes continuous iteration of development and testing throughout the software development cycle. So in the context of software was where Agile really first emerged or was defined explicitly. In the Agile model in software testing, both development and testing activities are concurrent, unlike the waterfall model. So waterfall model being, plan everything up front. You've got a 2-year plan. You start at the beginning, get to the end, deliver your product to the customer, and they say, what's this rubbish? This doesn't even meet our needs. And by the way, the world changed so much in 2 years, it wouldn't be relevant even if it did anymore. So Agile was kind of taking the wisdom of life and learning through small iterations, feedback from what actually happens from what you do and applying what you learn to the next step and so on and so forth. And so this is relevant in terms of product and service development, not only in software development anymore, but wider afield as well. And one thing to say about sociocracy off the bat, you could say it's bringing the Agile perspective to governance as well as operations. So this idea of developing policy or guidelines iteratively and incrementally, taking small steps, safe enough to fail experiments, testing hypotheses and learning through real world consequences and applying what you learn to what you do next. Now, I think it's fair to say that, that has relevance in most cases, but not every case. Sometimes you do need an upfront plan to a point. But I guess the question is, what are the minimal necessary constraints to move forward coherently and effectively, whilst leaving yourself maximum scope for variability and pivoting according to changing contexts as you need? So my conversation today is certainly going to address some of that and this issue of complexity and the fact that in complexity, there are so many unknown unknowns. So planning up front is really a misnomer in that kind of context. I'm just checking the chat here to see if there's anything else that if there's anything else that I should say here. Tracy was saying, Agile is a way of organizing for human connection, interaction, and learning over documentation and bureaucratic processes that see people as parts of the machine. There's a strong reminder there. I mean, whichever organizational context you're in, it's like you're working toward creating value for somebody or for somebodies. Whether that's an organization that's creating products and services for a customer, or even in a community context where you're your own customer. Nonetheless, a community exists to serve you and your fellow community members. So Agile is really focusing toward the customer, what the customer needs, building close relationship and fast feedback cycles, so that there's the opportunity for rapid learning. And you could look at that as using your limited time, energy, and resources in a manner that's as effective as possible toward responding to whatever the customer needs. Okay, let me see, what else do we have here? Patrick said, and on that, I prefer the people side of things. And we've also got a link to YouTube there from Kezari. I've never heard this name before, so apologies if I'm getting that wrong. Agile is one of the best practices in larger contexts, but some call lean thinking. Okay, lean is really about, well, that's as I was saying, doing as much as you can with as little as possible. So you will also find that there's a lot of methodologies and frameworks grown out of lean thinking as well, and often you'll hear about Agile and lean. That brings me to S3. So I'm going to say a few things about this for a few minutes, and please jump in if you have a question for understanding at any point, but I'm going to leave plenty of time in this call for questions after I'm done as well. So sociocracy, some of you might not have heard that term before at all, but I'm going to give you a parallel that will help you to get a grasp of it, which is democracy. And democracy means rule by the demos, or rule by those with voting privilege. It's got its roots in Athens, ancient Athens. Despite many people championing democracy, it's interesting because it was only adult males who were entitled to vote in ancient Athens, and anyone else, too bad for you. But over time, democracy as a concept has been adapted and evolved in many contexts around the world. And as you know, it's quite dominant in the Western world in terms of a kind of guiding principle for how we govern things. There's a lot going on in the chat here, but I'm just going to leave that for now. Sociocracy then has a similar root, the word krasi meaning rule, but socio relating to socius, or the social group. And the most immediate way to interpret the term sociocracy would be rule by the social group, which has parallels to the idea of self-organization, self-organizing teams, and so on and so forth. But interestingly, in its original form, it was a conception of government by Auguste Comte, who coined the term in around 1851. And what Comte was anticipating, so Comte also coined the term sociology. He was a positivist philosopher. Some people say there was a good Comte and a bad Comte, the bad Comte coming later. I don't have a personal opinion on that, but I definitely think his work has influenced people, sometimes for better and sometimes for worse. But his kind of underlying thesis in terms of conceptualizing sociocracy was the fact that government was often handled in a kind of feudal, fundamentalist manner, with some kind of power center who would make and develop agreements that affected everybody else, whether or not those decisions were reasonable or not. And what Kant thought was important as a positivist philosopher was the scientific method and bringing more empiricism into our decision making. And he foresaw that in future, governments would need to be more reasonable. They would need to embrace empiricism more and the scientific method to make and evolve decisions on the basis of facts, and on the basis of science and on the basis of the consequence of actions rather than on the basis of ideology, people's ideas. He said sociocracy was inevitable if we survived, and I don't think he was far wrong with that. Although I must say that these days I'm a little bit concerned at the unreasonableness I see often in the way that societies are running, not run, but running right now. And I think we have quite a lot of scope still to improve. So sociocracy, form of government, actually. I'm going to get to what Sociocracy 3.0 is in a minute, but let's go via the 1970s, so rolling forward 120 years. Gerard Endenberg from the Netherlands took a lot of various people's thinking around sociocracy, around Kant's early ideas, synergized that with his experience as a Quaker. So there was some kind of religious influence there. The essence of that being the idea that God isn't just some external entity, but is like God or wisdom is within all of us. This was one of his ideas. And he was also an engineer, so he brought a lot of engineering into this as well and developed the Sociocratic circle method, which simply put was the idea that if you take a traditional organizational hierarchy, you can still keep an operational hierarchy in the system, but rather than having a management hierarchy who kind of managed teams, Endenberg came up with the idea to shift the responsibility for governance to the whole team. So governance was done by a team, which a construct that he referred to as a circle. He saw the problems with top-down influence and said, well, why don't we link back up the system so we have teams select representatives who flow information and influence back up the system to create bottomarchy, which that wasn't his term, this is mine, it's not a real word, but you get the idea, hierarchy and bottomarchy. So you kind of counterbalance the two and bring influence from the bottom up. Introduce a way of making and evolving agreements based on consent. And what he meant by consent was bringing what Kant was arguing for, reason and empiricism into decision making, and selecting people for roles on the strength of the argument, aka giving people job security but not necessarily role security, and moving people around according to the strength of the argument for where people could most contribute. Not only where other people's opinion was that you could most contribute, but where your own opinion was where you could most contribute as well. And this became known as the Sociocratic circle method, which in the 80s was recognized as a form of social science by the University of Maastricht. And interestingly, I think around the mid-80s, it was recognized in the Netherlands that organizations over 50 people that by law were required to have a workers' council, a kind of form of union type representation. If the organization was structured as a sociocracy, then it didn't need a workers' council because sociocracy brought far more equivalence into the system than a workers' council ever did. So that was the Sociocratic circle method, and it broke out of the Netherlands in the late 1990s, early 2000s, and the first literature in English, of significant literature in English, emerged around 2007 with a book called We the People that was authored by John Buck and Sharon Villeins, both from the US. And from there, it's kind of knowledge and understanding of it is spread much more widely around the world. So, sociocracy, form of government, Sociocratic circle method, a methodology. I was very excited about this when I came across it in 2001. And by 2014, I was pretty busy throughout Europe, especially teaching this. And then one day, I met a guy called Bernard Bockelbrink, who's a co-developer of S3, along with my now wife, Liliana David. So the three of us develop it. And he came to a meetup in Berlin, where I was introducing the Sociocratic circle method. And he was very excited about it. He was an Agile coach and consultant. He'd been working in tech industry for many years. And he was seeing the limitations of applying Agile, I don't know how to put it really, but bringing the Agile perspective organization-wide. So if you looked in tech at that time, there was a lot of investment, and still is to this day, in developing agile teams. But those teams would tend to kind of be very effective within their own walls. But when it came to cross-team collaboration, dealing with dependencies, and bringing agility to the organization as a whole, then good luck to you. And there was this kind of weather front between the business end and the teams. And so that led to kind of limitation in what could be achieved, and often a quite traditional business end, and then a quite like horizontal, let's say, operational end, and the clash that occurred in between. And when he came across the idea of sociocracy and the Sociocratic Circle method, he was excited about that and its potential for governance. How it could help to bring governance to the business side of things in the organization as well. And his challenge to me was, as someone who'd been introducing the Sociocratic Circle method for many years to many people, did I know of any organizations who had attempted to implement the Sociocratic Circle method, kind of off the shelf, that over time persisted in using the Sociocratic Circle method as a whole? And I thought about that for about 20 seconds and then said, no, I don't. And he asked me, well, what do they do then? And I said, well, they kind of take what they think works, they change things that they think would be better changed, and they discard things that don't really make sense to them or don't seem to work. And they synergize that with all of the other things they do, including all of their habitual ways of doing things, for better or worse. But that's what people do. And he said, interesting, I've seen the same in the world of Agile and Lean. Maybe we should be telling people this. This idea of pulling in things when needed, when relevant, experimenting with them, adapting them as necessary to enrich what you currently do when your current approach fails to bring about the results you would expect or wish to see. And this led to what today is known as Sociocracy 3.0, which from one perspective is a menu of human behavior patterns that have emerged over time, evolved and prevailed because of their usefulness to people in certain contexts some of the time. Okay, so, and I want to make a point of emphasizing this because, we're habituated to look outside of ourselves for the answer. There's many holy grails available in the world today that are going to save you and make your organization effective and sweet. But the reality is much more complex than that. So Sociocracy 3.0, we've developed it in a way that relies on people, one, recognizing areas of need within their organizational context that their current approach fails to respond to effectively, and two, deciding to look outside of themselves for the answer, and three, should that be in the direction of Sociocracy 3.0, then offering kind of modular patterns that people can pull in according to specific areas of need within the organization, experiment with, and integrate depending on whether or not those patterns help them to effectively respond to the challenges and opportunities that they face. So it's a collection of processes, guidelines, and practices that people can pull from as they need. There's some advantages and disadvantages to having a menu, like a pull system for organizational change. The disadvantage, or one big disadvantage, is you need to know what's there. It's like if you go to a supermarket and everything's in packets and you can't understand what's on the packet and you can't see what's inside, then it's a bit difficult to figure out what you need. So the advantage of a prescription off-the-shelf framework or methodology is you kind of get it all at once. You learn the rules and then you run with that and see how things unfold. S3 is, in a way, it includes a lot of micro methods, but it does require some kind of insight into what those patterns are in order to be able to identify what you might need. So it's more reliant upon people's investment in learning. That said, in most organizational contexts today, whether or not people are familiar with S3 or not, you're going to find 20, 30, 40 of those patterns commonly present in the organization, because out of the 74 patterns we've currently defined in S3, all of them were there before S3 was ever conceived of. Because like I said, these are common human behavior patterns that make sense in certain contexts some of the time. So I'm going to hit pause here for a minute. That's enough monologue from me for a moment. I can move on in a while, but I'd like to just pause and see if there's any reflections or clarifying questions coming out of this before I move on.
Yeah, quick question, if I may. Taking contextual approaches towards or solution-driven approaches, right? In a situation where most agile frameworks being employed, they suggest that you use them like fully or in entirety. Otherwise, it's assumed that it's not going to be effective based on the prescription, right?
Yep.
So the dilemma for me right now is, at what point do we pick and choose from different processes that ensure that, like, is it like it's like not abusing, like that makes us feel like we're not abusing the process of each individual framework, right? So that's my question, if I put it right. Like, at what point do we pick and choose without actually abusing the process of the specific frameworks?
Right. Okay. So an existing framework you're using, or
yes. So,
yeah.
Yeah. So for example, I'll give a direct example of my organization. So I work with the Scrum team, right? I'll call it Scrum Band. Yeah. So, but at the organizational level, they're opting for a different process entirely. And unfortunately, there's no agile representation at that executive level. So now they want to adopt like a safe cadence, which is the 12 weeks to match the OKRs. But at the same time, they want to pull up the Scrum framework that the success of our tech team across different departments. So now you're talking about this is like a big solution for me, right? Like, it's just answering my questions right now. But I'm at a loss as to, in expanding that, is it okay to pick the different processes of the menu, as we say, from different processes to address the specific questions without it feeling like we are abusing the process of each of the specific frameworks?
Yeah, sure. And I'll go out on a limb here and propose that you can build Scrum or the SAFe framework out of S3 patterns. So if you want to understand what S3 is, it's like the Lego pieces that are used to put together a framework like Scrum or like SAFe. For those of you who are unfamiliar with that, I won't go into details of explaining it right now, but they're basically like a conglomerate of processes and agreements, that guide how you work, essentially. And so S3 patterns, if you break those processes down and those frameworks down, then you're going to find the patterns of S3. And this was how we put it together to begin with. So we said, okay, let's look at popular agile frameworks and methodologies, lean approaches to work, and various interpretations of sociocracy and the Sociocratic circle method, and see, could we strip it down to its component parts to understand how these things are put together? Because, the thing about something like SAFe or Scrum or the Sociocratic circle method or Adhocracy or some particular change management process or whatever it is you're using, it's going to be more or less relevant depending on the context. So you're going to have some organizational context where something like that will be a really good or at least a good enough fit. And people will say, yeah, it works for us. But you're going to have so much variance across different organizations that there's going to be, for every one where that's appropriate, there's going to be many where it generates a lot of waste, either because what people are doing already is good enough in 80% aspects of the work. It's just 20% where there's real problems. So if you pivot and pull in a whole framework that changes everything, then you might gain some benefit in terms of that 20% area of ineffectiveness somehow, but it could cost you across 40 or 50% of the organization because you throw out everything that's evolved over time through the actual learned experience of the people, maybe in a kind of adhocracy, but nonetheless something that reflected the learning of people over time. So S3 patterns say, identify areas of need within the system, prioritize them. So don't change everything at once, because you know what can happen. You change one thing and it can lead to a myriad of unintended consequences. So prioritize, make small changes where you can, so far as you can, and monitor closely and learn from what the consequences are, and proceed iteratively from there. So S3 patterns can complement whatever you're doing. If you're using Scrum, they can help you to enrich Scrum. Scrum doesn't tell you how to make and evolve agreements, for example, within the team. Yeah. So clarifying the why, being able to pull together a proposal and harness distributed intelligence of the team to do so, to test that proposal to see if there's any reasons why it might lead to consequences you want to avoid, risks that are better to be avoided or worthwhile ways of improving, and so on. There are patterns in S3 that are going to help you to do all of these things. So it's going to enrich whatever it is you're doing. And it's like that by design. Does that answer your question?
Thanks.
Yeah. No, thanks
Perfectly.
for the question.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I would like to find out, like, take for example, Scrum. They have their guideline, the principles and values. Would the Sociocratic circle method not interfere with some of those frameworks, guidelines, and values or principles?
Yeah, well, I think the Sociocratic circle method might. And I'm not, to be honest, a big fan of the Sociocratic circle method, because it's a methodology that has more or less relevance depending on the context. It's like the scaling, the implications of scaling with what Endenberg called double linking. If you imagine that every team selects a representative to link up the hierarchy, every team's operating as a circle, selecting people to roles throughout the system. That's quite a big investment up front. So if you're going to make a pivot towards something like that, then the question is, why would you do it? And do you think that that's the most effective way to spend your time? So I think it can be quite disruptive in that regard. Some people say that, if you're not doing Scrum by the book, then you're not doing Scrum. But most people with experience of Scrum say if you're doing Scrum by the book, you haven't learned to appreciate Scrum, because it's a framework. It's there to give you a starting point. And what Scrum does, and please forgive me if you're not familiar with Scrum, but it helps people learn how to collaborate, right? You have to work together to achieve your goal, the sprint goal, as they say. But there's a whole, Scrum isn't an answer to everything. Scrum is just a way of organizing work in increments, right? And keeping a close eye on what it is that you do, and testing regularly throughout the process, and keeping your iterations small so that you can learn as much as possible as you go. In a nutshell, this is what it's about. But it doesn't help you with governance, doesn't help you with decision making, doesn't help you with structuring the organization as a whole. For that, there's scaling frameworks. But again, the scaling frameworks, if you break them down into their component parts, there are a series of patterns that have been put together in a particular way. And so in context A, that might be super appropriate for you. But in context B, that might not work so well, or not even at all, at least in some areas of the organization. So what do you do then, right? You go to the supermarket of scaling frameworks to see what's available and which might fit best? Well, this is what a lot of people do, actually, metaphorically speaking. Or you say, okay, what's good enough already? What won't we change? Because for now it works well enough and we don't want to disrupt that over there. But where do we specifically struggle? Where are the problems? And what's the smallest change we can make for the most gain, right? And let's make that change and see how that affects the system as a whole and proceed from there, right? So this is the kind of rationale behind S3, this idea of a pull system for change in response to prioritized areas of need.
Thank you.
Anyone else with any questions or reflections? I'd love to hear some of what's going on for you as well in this. Yeah, Tracy.
Can you just say a little bit more about what you said earlier about, being able to keep the operational hierarchy, but shifting responsibility, and by shifting responsibility, we're really shifting relationship and how we learn and circulate knowledge and information through the system. Can you just say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think this is a really hot topic these days, okay? Because a lot of people are railing against the idea of hierarchy, of command and control paradigm. And there's this like strong move in many places towards flattening the hierarchy, more kind of horizontal organizations, bringing equality throughout systems and so on. And I'd say something a little bit controversial here. We're not equal as human beings, right? And that's not a bad thing. The issue we have is when, because of people's having more or less influence, more or less opportunity, more or less insight, access to information, resources, and so on, that inequality leads to negative outcomes for people, right? And in an organizational context, that leads to negative outcomes for some people over other people, and to the detriment of the organization as a whole, right? So S3 patterns are for people who want to collaborate together, right? There's a precondition here. If you don't want to collaborate with other people, then I suggest you reevaluate your life and ask yourself why you're in the organizational context you're in. So there's a precondition for this. But at the same time, collaboration isn't always the way forward in an organization. In fact, we want to free people up to make and evolve agreement. Free people up to create value for themselves as much as possible in an organizational context. We want to liberate people to use their common sense. We want to position people within an organizational system where they can contribute most and where they benefit most in terms of what's meaningful and rewarding for them, because we know that engagement correlates with performance, and commitment and people taking responsibility and following through and so on. But we also need to handle dependencies throughout the organization. We need to be able to identify them quickly and respond to them appropriately. And sometimes that requires the input of various stakeholders throughout the system, and sometimes benefits from some kind of hierarchy, where you have people with a higher level of abstraction dealing with broader issues concerning the wider organization, and other people who are dealing with things more locally, which is often more on the operational level, more on the business end of the organization, strategic development and managing the business as a whole somehow. So if we go back to the Sociocratic circle method for a minute, despite the limitations I think that it has, what's interesting about it is by double linking in the system, it enabled wisdom, perspectives, information to flow up the system as well as down. So essentially, it was kind of starting toward harnessing the distributed intelligence throughout the organization and supporting the flow of that to the people in the organization who had the authority and or the responsibility to deal with those kinds of things. In S3, we took that quite a bit further. We've got a pattern called navigate by attention. And what navigate by attention is leveraging the fact that as human beings, our preferred state is unconsciousness. But as we go through life, anytime we perceive a situation that appears different to what we expect or wish to see, then it grabs our attention. And the reason it grabs our attention is because we've evolved to identify obstacles and tools that are useful for us. So navigate by attention in an organizational context says, let's all pay attention to what's happening around us. And when we experience tension, check behind to see, is there a situation that's relevant to the organization? Because responding to it would help the organization somehow, or not responding would harm the organization somehow. Let's understand that, and let's flow that information to the people who are most able to respond to it, if that's not us personally, for ourselves. So you're kind of creating a human sensor network, where people are acting like nerve endings of the system and flowing information through the system to wherever it needs to go in order for the system to respond in an appropriate manner somehow. So hierarchy, in a sense, is quite natural in organizations. If you, Tracy and Todd, were the founders of an organization, and then you invited some of us to collaborate with you, then you might invite some of us to come in as partners initially, but at some point, if our organization grows, we might need other people too. And we decide, well, let's delegate responsibility for these areas of work to others. We'll employ people and we'll give them a role there. So we can do that in a very humane way or a very inhumane way. But nonetheless, we enter into contract with people and we kind of delegate aspects of the organization to them. This is the birth of a hierarchy, right? There's a hierarchy of accountability, because at the moment, if you, Tracy, and Todd are still the owners of the organization, then ultimately the buck stops with you, and you employ people to take different pieces of the pie. And so that's useful. There's nothing wrong with that, and if we all agree to that and it works for all of us, great. But if you can mobilize everybody who comes on board to have a sense of ownership of the organization, to take their responsibilities seriously, to see their responsibility in the context of the organization as a whole as well, and for everyone to be on the lookout for situations that matter to the organization somehow, because it's helpful to respond in some way. And you've got enough clarity over who's taking responsibility for what. I don't mean nailing everything down, but just enough clarity around approximately what people have responsibility for and where they are autonomous. Then you can have some clarity on where to flow information when you as a member of the organization become aware of something important and it's outside of the scope of your responsibilities or your capacity to deal with that somehow. Okay, so there's a concept in S3 called driver, which is like the motive for responding to a situation. And there's another concept called domain. And domain is a distinct area of influence, activity, and decision-making within the organization. All organizations are divided up into domains, right? More or less clearly, more or less coherently. Sometimes different people have different ideas about who's responsible for what. It's not always clear. But my point here is, if you want to mobilize the fuller potential of a system, especially a large system, then you want everybody to be a leader within their domain. So they need to be clear on what they're responsible for. They need to be clear on where the limits of their autonomy are. They need to be clear on who their kind of immediate codependents are in terms of shared dependencies. And you need a system in place to flow information and influence through the system when necessary, because the consequences of a decision in an area exceed the scope of authority of the people in that domain. So patterns like clarify and develop domains. This is a pattern in S3. Respond to organizational drivers, describe organizational drivers, link between domains. These are all building blocks within the menu of patterns of S3. So it's not about, oh, should we be a hierarchy or should we be flat? The question is, what do we need? And what are we going to do in response to this particular driver that concerns us right now? Is it an agreement that we need? Is it some guidelines? Is it a product, a service? Is some small action? Or do we need to make a structural change to ensure that we can continue to respond effectively to the needs we've identified as important, and to do that in the most effective way? Okay. And maybe just to round that off, Tracy, coming back to this point of equality, and I was saying we're not all equal. There's a principle in S3, in fact, there's 7, but one of them is equivalence. And when we say equivalence, what we mean by that is people affected by decisions being able to make and or influence those decisions on the basis of reason to do so. And this is an idea that goes right back to Kant, because he said it takes so much effort to kind of have a command and control paradigm for governing a state, because if you let your guard down, the people will kind of come through the door. He said it's much better to have people on board, and people are going to be more on board if decisions make sense, right? And so over time, sociocracy has evolved to say, well, let's harness distributed intelligence. So anyone who sees a reason why doing something in a certain way is not good enough, leads to consequences we want to avoid, or risks we want to avoid, or ways to improve. Let's make sure we can get that information into the system so that whoever has responsibility for that area can integrate that wisdom and make a better decision than the one they were going to make today. But it also says, and if people are affected by decisions, then ensure that they can make or at least have influence in the decisions that affect them, but constrain it to ensure that those decisions are reasonable. Yeah, aka they demonstrate ways in which things can be improved. Thanks for the question, Tracy. Adhocracy, love it, David says. I love it too. It's such a great term, isn't it? I don't remember where I came across it from, but why not? I mean, most of the time we apply adhocracy in our lives, right? We're all making it up to a point, alongside running on our familial ancestral patterns, many of which we adopted without even realizing we did. But the problem with adhocracy from the start is you can develop bad habits as well as good ones. And I see a lot of organizations, at the startup phase, you need a lot of fluidity. There's going to be a lot of chaos and uncertainty. But the question I often ask is it worthwhile putting in a few constraints, and developing a bit of coherence from the start so that people become habituated in a few loose constraints, because that's going to pay off as an organization grows. And if you don't, then later, it takes much more effort sometimes to unlearn something than it does to learn something new from the start. Tracy was saying purpose and domain drives our organizational structure in a sense, rather than static positional power and roles, if I summarize that right. Exactly. Yeah, start with the why. It's like there's the big why for the organization as a whole. Something's happening and relevant and needed in the world for the organization to exist, and people are working to transform time, energy, and resources into something valuable that feeds that need somehow. And out of that will come a cascade of sub drivers, sub needs that require responding to as well. This is just how things are. So yeah, if you're focused on what's needed now in the context of why your organization exists, then you're in a process of continuous discovery, and you make changes as you experiment with responding to those needs. So from that point of view, organizational structure, the rules, regulations, guidelines that you put in place are in response to those needs, not in the response to the ideology or opinions or influence of a few people, without being coherent with what the organization actually needs. So you're in service of emergence. Yeah, you're kind of midwifing the organization perpetually into existence or into its next phase. Yeah. I don't have a problem with static positional power and roles, but the question is, does it make sense? And is there a reason not to do it like that anymore? Would it be helpful to adjust it? Is it really the best we have right now? Because if it's good enough, fine, but when it's not good enough anymore, how able are you to identify why and to harness the distributed intelligence to make and evolve agreements that help you to respond to those needs in a better way? So lots of comments here. Jonathan, there's also some value to a bit of hybrid organizational style where there's both a hierarchy and transparency, a great flex state when moving from traditional to agile adjacent workflows. Exactly, and that that transition is really important as well. If you're in a more traditional organizational context and you want to decentralize power to influence more, you want to bring a more agile approach into how you develop things, then you want to do that in a kind of careful way, like a step-by-step way. And transparency, aka information being available, people knowing it's available, people knowing, see, this is not easy, people knowing when there's information that's important to them, right? Because there's a lot of information. So you need ways to be able to develop transparency in the system that's not only passive, but is also active as well. Not always easy, Jonathan was saying, but always kickstarts some accountability and change from upper management. Yeah, true. On accountability, that's one of the 7 principles of S3. We see accountability as like doing what you agreed to and responding, taking responsibility for the organization as a whole. not just your own specific domain. So if I take responsibility, including taking responsibility for being a member of the organization, then I'm accountable. And I often say you can take responsibility, but accountability in an organization is shared. We're all accountable somehow, in some part, for how that organization performs as a whole. David, I'm picking up hints of enterprise architecture, from not only a business perspective, but maybe a social and human architectural perspective. Maybe a way to manage or facilitate the relationships part of the architectural model. We usually talk about the boxes in the model and not the lines that connect the boxes. I feel this discussion is describing the lines in the model. Anyone else? Yeah. You know, one of the most common questions I get asked when I'm introducing people to S3 is, oh, well, what do you do in this situation? And my answer to that is always, what would you do? And I think this is quite key here, because S3 is not telling you how to do things, right? It's giving you an insight into wisdom that our ancestors developed over time somehow. And it's helping to bring more consciousness to many patterns that we're familiar with actually in different aspects of our lives already. But by making them more conscious, it gives us more choice about what to pull in. But many people have said the Sociocratic circle method is an empty method, because it's helping you to harness intelligence and to make and evolve agreements that you develop for yourself. And there's a lot of that in S3 as well. So in terms of, S3 patterns are relevant on the business side of the organization, but also on the social side as well. But navigate via attention then relates not only to your products and services you're developing, but also the social side. So those of you who can see me today, I've got a poster behind me with the elephants in the room. There's often elephants in the room. And, if we can recognize them, AKA what brings tension to us, and where do we see situations that aren't good enough or we think could be improved? And how do we bring those into the consciousness of the organization and bring together the right people to make and evolve agreements in response to those areas of opportunity or challenge that we see? Navigate via attention helps us to respond rapidly to changing contexts and to generate ways of responding that are owned by the people, because the people who are affected have some influence in deciding how things are developed and then the decisions that are made to respond to those areas of need. What else have we got here? Perpetual birth is a difficult proposition. I wouldn't know personally, but I can definitely imagine. Yep, absolutely. Adoption is easy. Transformation is a challenge. Oh, well, Jonathan, could you say more about that in terms of adoption versus transformation, just so be clear we understand the context you're sharing this in?
Well, I think he had to head out early.
Okay. Well, any guesses on what he meant by this, anyone?
Oh, no.
Hey, great. There you are. Yeah, referring to getting people up and running with tools. Okay, yeah. So, we're going to adopt patterns from S3, fine, but the reality when the pedal hits the metal, right, and actually getting people on board and helping people to learn and engage. I got it. Yeah, absolutely. This is another misunderstanding often around S3 is you don't implement S3. It doesn't make sense, because it's like going to the restaurant and ordering everything on the menu. It just doesn't make sense. You're going to the restaurant on a given day with specific preferences and needs, and you look at the menu and you see what you might need. We see many cases of adoption of frameworks these days, regardless of whether people want it or not, and regardless of whether or not that actually plays out in the reality of the organization in which it's adopted. And at the end of the day, transformation not only is a challenge, it's challenging, and we're habituated to behave in the ways we do for very good reasons. So there has to be a pretty good reason for us to consider behaving in a different way, which again is an argument for why it's helpful to identify and prioritize areas of need and pull in patterns that you think might help you have a better day, because you've already acknowledged that your current approach isn't good enough and you're looking for a way to improve. Without that, then the motivation and discipline required for investing what's needed into unlearning and initiating change is often too much. Yeah. What else do we have here? Let's see. Changing way of thinking is totally different. It's really hard to get me changing my way of thinking. I have to say I'm pretty fixed. Yeah, so sometimes we need to get banged over the head a few times with the consequences of our actions being different to what we had hoped for before we're willing to kind of step out of ourselves and consider how we were part of getting ourselves into that challenge in the first place. Yeah. Could you walk us through an example of how the patterns in Sociocracy 3.0 could be used in government context? Now, yeah. So in Canada right now,
it doesn't need to be a government context, but any. I'm just curious to walk through this sort of thinking and patterns of using them.
Yeah, sure. Well, what I'm going to do, I'm just going to share a link with you a minute, which is going to take you to a clickable patterns map, and it's going to give you a. So there's the Sociocracy 30 website. This is our online patterns library. Patterns.sociocracy30.org, and that link takes you to this kind of interactive map. And if you're able to follow that link right now, then what you'll see is 10 categories of patterns and 7 principles down in the bottom right. So for those of you who can't see this, there's categories like co-creation and evolution, meeting practices, organizational structure, defining agreements. We've also got patterns for bringing in S3. Oh, there we go. Thanks for sharing the screen. Yeah, so there's even patterns for bringing in S3 patterns as well. So in terms of an example, well, there's only one way to start ever in any organizational context with S3, I would say. And that is, as I've said already, to identify where things aren't good enough as they are. Okay, so navigate via attention, as I said already, is about, looking behind that inner state of alert we experience when there's a dissonance between what we perceive and what we would hope or expect to see. And so inviting that inquiry in any organizational context is a really good place to start. You can frame that somewhat if you like. So, we use a couple of tools. One of them is called 4 dimensions. This is nothing to do with S3, but it's just something personally myself and Liddy, my partner whom I work with on this often, use, which says it's an invitation for people to look at the responsiveness within the organization, the level of participation in the organization, the effectiveness of doing the work in the organization, the operations, and making and evolving agreements. And invite people to look at those 4 dimensions and answer the question, where am I strong and where am I challenged? Okay. And the reason both of those are important is because many people are kind of problem focused, and that makes sense, because we want to remove problems from our lives. If things are good enough already, then we shouldn't waste too much energy on that. But recognizing where you're strong and what's good enough already is helpful, because you can amplify that already. And it also helps to counterbalance areas where perhaps you could improve as well. So from there, you start to see, well, for example, we're really busy doing a lot of things. But if I'm honest, probably 70% of those things aren't really worth doing at all. So we're good at doing things, but we're not doing the right things, for example. So we could do a diagnostic there and say, okay, well, where could we improve then? And we might have to go back to our decision making, say, well, we need to bring together relevant stakeholders here to redesign or reclarify some constraints, and objectives so that we can get more value out of our limited time in terms of doing the work, for example. Okay, so tools like this, the other one I won't go into, you'll find it on the Sociocracy 30 website, is the Common Sense Framework, which is like 10 sort of principles for teams and organizations. Things like being clear on your purpose, developing strategy that's appropriate to respond to that purpose, freeing people up to create value as much as possible for themselves, identifying and responding effectively to dependencies and so on. Same kind of approach. Where are you strong? Where are you challenged? So that's going to reveal a kind of tailor-made backlog of areas of need in the organization that you can prioritize somehow. And, you know, just because you've got a problem, like you might identify a problem with culture, it doesn't mean to say culture is the place you're going to stop, right? Because you might backtrack and say, well, culture sucks because people aren't free enough to use their common sense and respond effectively. You know, there's a decision-making hierarchy, and that creates bottlenecks, and that's upsetting everybody, you know, and that's screwing up our culture. So, you know, you can start to prioritize in terms of where you make interventions. So that's relevant in any organizational context. I think so. You know, there are many patterns, if you look at the menu, that are going to be relevant in most cases, including in government as well. I think where this is really interesting in terms of government, besides the fact that most governments could organize much more effectively than they currently do, is matters of governance of state. And this blows my mind, and I'm no expert on this. There are others who are thinking about this more, S3, in the context of governance. But I think the question around decision-making is a very interesting one, because I see government as a service organization, right? And I don't think that's actually true in most cases today, but I think that's what it should be. You know, government should be constrained by the people, not government constraining the people ultimately. And, you know, government is a mechanism for delegating responsibility for decision-making of a state to fewer people who have some competence, hopefully, for them to make and evolve agreements on behalf of the whole, and to handle all of the various administrative and logistical elements that flow from that as well. So if we look at current approach to governance in most Western world today, then you have this voting and majority, you know, majoritarian democracy, basically. The problem with majority is that new wisdom usually emerges through the minority, not the majority. So there's a design flaw right there, you know, because you're with a diminishing set of options, basically, in terms of wise decisions, because as new insights, new perspectives and wisdom merges into the system, it gets sidelined in favor of the majority. And so over time, if I can put it bluntly, I think that majority decision making leads to growing stupidity, not growing wisdom and intelligent decisions. And apologies if I offend anyone there, but I genuinely think that's the case. You know, and a good example was that, you know, people were pretty convinced that the sun went around the earth for a very long time. And those early people who challenged that on the basis of their empirical observations were dismissed and threatened with death and so on and so forth. You know, the usual kind of things we do to the minority point of view. But as it turned out, you know, it seems these days that actually the earth goes around the sun and not the other way around, you know, and it took us a while to get used to that. So that's a problem with leaning to or giving supremacy to the majority. If we're more egalitarian about things, we might lean towards consensus. But the problem with consensus is it's just not effective at any scale. It might be appropriate in a kind of single focused interest group, you know, that's not too large and you're just dealing with a few issues. But consensus in a complex organizational system, consensus for a state, like forget it, because, you know, you're not all going to agree. And actually that's part of the richness, isn't it? Because when we disagree, we can explore that space between apparently differing points of view, and in that space we discover new learning and insights. You know, we kind of transcend the binary conundrum of either or thinking to develop a more nuanced, higher resolution point of view. One of the things that attracted me most to Sociocracy originally, and particularly what Gerard Endenberg developed, the consent decision-making process, was consent is seeking to establish whether or not an agreement is good enough by checking for any reasons not to do it, right? So in consensus, you're seeking, in consensus with unanimity, you're seeking everybody to be in agreement. You're kind of working toward agreement. And so you have lobbying, you spend a lot of time on putting together proposals, you adjust them in the hope that you can present it in a manner where nobody's going to push back on it. And everybody's going to say, yeah, this is great for me. But a bit like with majority decision making, you're going to diminish the potential appropriateness or richness of that decision, in favor of bringing everybody on board because it kind of fits with their point of view. Consent decision making is interesting because it shifts supremacy from people to argument. Okay, so it says any argument that can demonstrate how proceeding in a certain way will lead to consequences that are best avoided, will expose us to risks that we don't want to afford, or we can't afford to take, or don't wish to take, or any argument that demonstrates a worthwhile way to improve, aka it demonstrates practically what we can do to improve something, is an argument worth hearing. And so in matters of governance in organizational systems, this doesn't mean to say everybody's involved in every decision. We want to delegate responsibility for decision making to as few people as possible, and we're going to distribute that throughout the organization in whichever way makes sense. So if we go to the example of government, for example, having a group of representatives acting on behalf of state who make and evolve agreements in the context of different domains concerning that state is fine. However, when there's a decision or a proposition that's made where people who will be affected by that and or people with expertise who can see problems with that, where they're able to introduce those arguments, and those arguments can be received by the stakeholders who have responsibility for these agreements, then that wisdom can be integrated and used to evolve the decision in some way. Okay, and so this is really the conundrum, because the question is, like, how do you handle that at scale? I don't have full answers to that, but I do have a really nice little story that I'll share, and then I'll stop and see if any of you want to say or ask anything on this. There was I think it was the late 70s. I might be wrong on that, but the late 70s, in Edinburgh Electrotechnique, there was a crisis in the shipping industry. And so Edinburgh Electrotechnique, they make electrical components, and they had a micro welding department that made micro components for the shipping industry. And there was a crisis in the shipping industry. And so the board, despite their aspirations towards being more equivalent, more sociocratic, they decided that they would have to let go the welders in the micro welding department. And Max, who was working in another department, heard about this and said, but wait a minute, I don't think this is a good idea. I think there's a worthwhile way to improve. So he went to the board and he said, listen, I don't think this is a good idea, just laying them off, because we expose ourselves in the future, we diminish our capacity and diversity for production later. But secondly, he said, we make really good products, and so the issue here is just that our current customers aren't enough to, we don't have enough demand among our current customers to keep the micro welding team going. But how about we use the remaining budget, get the micro welders some training in sales, buy them some suits, and they can go out in the world and sell our product because they're pretty good. So the board thought, that sounds like a risk we could afford to take, and it would generate the possibility of finding new avenues for revenue. So they did that, and micro welders don't like wearing suits very much or selling things, but they did it anyway. And they went out into the community, and in the middle of that crisis, they were able to generate enough new business that 6 months later they were turning work away. And so it's a small example, but it's why I think it's powerful is because it helps you to see that, the board, if we say, okay, we could use that as a metaphor for government, making a decision, but somebody in the system sees why that idea somehow harms the whole and can see some way to approach that problem in a different way that ultimately is going to prove more beneficial, more valuable than the current decision being made. And so by presenting that argument, the board received that argument not as Max's objection, but as their own objection, because it was an argument that made sense. So they took ownership of it, and they then executed on that decision. It wasn't Max. Max carried on doing whatever Max did on a daily basis. but it saved the micro welding department, and they went on to produce another day. So this is a question I have, in terms of government. It's like the madness of majority decision making as the ultimate way in which we make and evolve agreements. It just leads to polarization, actually, and arguably, I'm not sure we've lived in a more polarized world than the one we live in today. I'm sad to say, especially recently. But consent decision making has this potential because it's harnessing intelligence from wherever it might emerge. And the place it usually emerges first is through the minority. And S3 patterns enable us to delegate power to influence throughout systems in whichever ways make sense. And I've already argued for why hierarchy in some cases makes a lot of sense. So that's the same in a state with a government. You have a hierarchy of sorts. But if that hierarchy can pivot towards tyranny without constraint, and if supremacy shifts to those people rather than reasoned argument that helps us to learn and evolve, then we have a very big problem. And I think we can see some of the consequences of those kind of problems today.
And if I can add to this, because I've been thinking about, incorporating some S3 patterns into, our context where we all live. And I was thinking we have this kind of pattern already of the take me with you kind of thing. I have a lower level person attend a higher level meeting kind of as a guest, which is great. But what if that was an entrenched process where lower level in the hierarchy could be a part of those higher meetings, which is an S3 pattern, which I find really interesting, called double linking hierarchy. That might be, but yeah, I thought that was interesting how to take something that works well now, but kind of give it a little bit of a boost and put it into our formal process.
Yeah. So the double linked hierarchy, and I agree with you, Todd. The problem with double linked hierarchy, as I've said, is it doesn't scale well, and I think that's a fair critique. At the same time, the principle is what you need to look at. And the problem that double-linked hierarchy responds to is a lack otherwise of information and influence flowing through the system in a way that benefits the organization as a whole. So if we break it down, what a double-linked hierarchy is a system of self-managing teams. So it's like we're tribal, right? So if you leave a team to its own devices, it's generally going to organize it as a silo, and just go about managing its day. And so there's no problem with that. The problem, as I said before, is when there's dependencies, and decisions in one domain start to influence another domain, or there's dependencies between two domains and so on. So then you need to put in place means to identify and respond to those dependencies. And some of those things will be operational, but some of those things are going to be matters of governance, aka making and evolving agreements that constrain future decisions and actions within the organization somehow. And so the other component of double-linked hierarchy is linking and selecting representatives. So we're familiar with representative democracy, for example. I mean, that makes sense to us. We don't want everybody turning up everywhere to make and evolve agreements, so we select representatives by and for the people. And linking is really that formal conduit that you put in place. It's an agreement between two domains where you say, okay, when you link, then somebody selected from one domain participates as an equivalent member in the governance decision-making of another domain. And you can do that on the horizontal, between teams, or in the case of double-linked hierarchy, you can do it up and or down the system. We're used to doing it down the system, of course, with management hierarchy, but you can do it up the system as well. So the double-linked hierarchy is great. It's a great pattern to understand and to consider. It's a great way to hack an existing hierarchy. There's limitations in terms of scaling, but the key point I'm making here is the freeing teams up to make and evolve agreements for themselves as much as possible, the self-governing component, and the linking component, it consciously deciding when it's useful to flow influence from one domain to another. And in the case of government, then of course, you've got this question of who can like officially participate in the decision-making processes, you know, and to what extent and in which ways. And you want that on the horizontal level, you know, on the community level, the regional level, and so on. But you also want it on the hierarchy, the horizontal, the vertical level as well. Yeah. Yeah.
And I believe Cesare, you had your.
Hi.
Hey.
Thank you very much. This is really fascinating. I really enjoy this. I'll try to be very brief. I think one thing that really struck chord with me is what you said in terms of, you know, looking at the kind of system that we have. You started off with democracy, and we always like to think, what is the way that we want our society to be, right? And then we come up with all these ideas, and everybody has a different idea. But there is a very interesting theory that's emerging right now from David Snowden of the Cynefin Network. He's working now on something new, which is very similar. It sounds like he wants to steal your thing. I don't know what's going on, because he wants to call it estuary in Welsh. So I have no idea what it's going to be, if it's going to be pronounceable or not. But it sounds very fascinating that you guys are talking. So you know who I'm talking about, right?
I know Dave. Yeah.
Yeah. So he's making this kind of a right now the OODA loop or framework with Cynefin framework. He's bringing it together, and he's using constructor theory. And I'm not going to go into this right now, but that's something of a higher level from quantum sort of theory that makes its way into organizational theory. Mm-hmm. You were talking about, you know, a lot about quality, and then you talked about nuance. And the issues that we're having right now, I think, in many organizations, but governments, and I just want to separate like government, the people that rule, and the administration, that the people that actually administer what happens, and the programs and so on. Which I see like there's a lot of colleagues here from that domain, if you will, of many domains. So. The issue is that we're dealing with a lot of fuzzy things, right? They're not really clear, and there is a lot. We talk about transparency, but there is really a very strict hierarchy that we have. We know about this, and it's not something that we can overcome. It's something we have been working on to sort of not necessarily, if you will, change, but to deal with from the bottom up for quite a very long time, and I've been part of it for 15 years or so, and we're still running into the same kind of issues that we did back then. And I think a lot of people on the call would probably, that remember, would recognize that. So in terms of the constructive theory, there is just the thing that you think about, okay? There are the creators and the counterfactuals, but creators are things you can replicate. Counterfactuals are things that are just impossible in the physical universe. Like you can't overcome gravity; it exists everywhere, right? So it's a limitation. So you take the limitation, and it kind of to reverse of our idealism of what kind of society we want to have. A question to ask is exactly what you kind of implied is. What kind of society do we absolutely not want to have? And I think we can all agree that it is a dictatorship, right? And you know what? Dictatorships are the most efficient systems that exist in terms of political and organizational, not very good ones, but not for everything, but they can be very efficient. And do we really want that kind of level of efficiency? So I think that's not what we're talking about. But another thing that we talked about is decision making and the distributed decision making, which I think is the key to everything that we're talking about, regardless of the theory that you create. You call it the menu, and you can pick and choose. And in the end, when you are an executive, and I'm not, just to clarify, okay, but I advise some executives, and hopefully some of them listen. But I hear what they're saying. They are overwhelmed, and in terms of decision making, it's very difficult because there are things that they can't share with everybody openly as much as we want to be transparent. They just can't do it, and we have to understand that. So we need a distributed decision making, and that brings me into some of the ideas that I have been working on, studying Dave Snowden's Cynefin framework and other frameworks that hover around that. Wisdom of the crowds, okay, is one of the things that can help us, okay? And debiasing the data, leveraging human intelligence, augmenting it with other forms of intelligence that are not human, let's put it that way, near real-time feedback, and from different tiers. Okay, so in the UK government, they talked about the red team, which was like experts that you go and they debunk it and they look at it, but you can have it at many different levels. Dave Snowden calls his approach the entangled trios, where he gets like 3 people, and he would have like a novice, expert, and someone who is kind of a horizontal. Just the way you kind of mentioned it, it's probably very similar to your model, and throwing a question at 10th trios that come, and through the wisdom of the crowd, they bring it all together. Okay. And now the issue is, that's great. How do you actually implement that? How do you bring that forward so you can bring to the forefront from the sensory networks and expert networks? How do you bring that to the executive decision makers? And it is not algorithmic, but it's potentially algorithm enhanced, but it's human intelligence that's coming. It also needs to have anonymity. And if people are aware of the wisdom of the crowd, is very simple. At a country fair, you ask 10 farmers who raise cows, how much does this cow weigh? They will give you, all their estimates, and they'll be extremely accurate, the average of them, but they all have to be experienced farmers, cattle farmers. They all have to have experience in that. They all have to be anonymous, so they can know the other person's, guess, because they will hedge, and it has to be a form of a game. If they have something at stake, then it's really very difficult to get that. But if you have those 3 conditions, then you can really leverage wisdom of the crowds. What we need right now is some kind of a way to put it together in form of fairly simple tools that we can propose to the executives to try, test, see if it works. And the problem we have with data, just to really finish, is that a lot of the data that we had historically, we can't use anymore. We need to create new data, and it exists. We humans are smarter than our data, and we can bring that wisdom of the crowds through the wisdom of the crowds together. Then we have a potential, and there are some tools, and I'm hoping to test them very soon. And those who are interested in this sort of thing, like executive decision making, sense networks, and different tools that we can use that can help executives, ping me, let me know, and I'll get you involved in this. So that's my little pitch. But I just want to say, what do you think about what I said in terms of the S3 and your way of thinking? Thank you.
Thank you, Cesare. Well, I think you lay out the need very well. And you also lay out some enabling constraints here. If we think of things like harnessing wisdom of the crowd, debiasing behavior, leveraging human intelligence and augmenting it, this gives us some guardrails within which to operate. But they're not like governing constraints in terms of limiting us, but they're more constraining us in ways that enable better outcomes than we would achieve otherwise. And as you were saying as well, from different tiers and near real time, these are key challenges. And S3 patterns, I think the title of this call was something about enabling collaboration at any scale. And what you're talking about here again is organizing in domains. You've got a hierarchical system somehow. You're distributing power and influence throughout the system in a way that makes most sense. You want to have a kind of nervous system through which that information can flow rapidly, so in near real time, to wherever it needs to go. And you have to kind of ask the question, who is most able to contribute to what? Because as you say, there are sometimes people need to understand how to cook the meal to be able to comment on whether or not the meal's being cooked right. And a lot of people just don't know how to cook that meal, for example. So we have to, there's so much wisdom in how we've done things until now. The way the Western nations are set up, generally speaking, is pretty damn good, all things considered, considering how it could be. And so I'm arguing for not throwing the baby out with the bathwater here and looking at the wisdom in the structure. But as you said, the question is, right, like what do we absolutely not want? Or another way of putting that is, what's really not tolerable right now? What is not good enough? we could spend the rest of our lives focusing on problems, but which ones are most important to deal with now? And how can we constrain the system in a manner that most helps us to respond to that? So totally agree. This kind of relationship between human intelligence and AI and the technology we have available today, undoubtedly this is a necessary step that we need to take if we're to solve the complexity of problems we face in an effective way. And I think this is the leading edge in terms of where we can go. And I would argue that S3 patterns are anyway prevalent in organizational systems like this. And by making them more conscious, perhaps S3 can offer a contribution in just bringing a little bit more consciousness and intentionality in how we set up these organizations, and some of the guidelines that constrain how we collaborate in terms of our work and making evolving agreements. But everything that you're mentioning here and a lot more besides is also essential for us to understand and integrate if we're going to deal with these challenges ahead of us in an effective way. Yep. Todd, we're on 58, so I'm going to hand back to you, man.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I know a lot of talking. I'm sure you're looking for a nice glass of water. That was great. Thank you so much. As always, these talks are like to discovering new ways of learning, new ways of doing things, and thinking about them and thinking about work very deliberately, which is a lot of fun. But yeah, thank you so much. Thank you all for coming. Yeah, this was awesome. I know I was captivated myself. I kind of turned into a participant for these things. So thank you all for coming. I hope you have a great day and happy holidays.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.